I'd like to talk a little bit about games, and in particular, what games even actually are. Because I think some people have begun losing touch with the fundamental idea of what makes a game anyway. And even though most people probably have a pretty good idea of what a game is and they know a game when they see a game, it's actually not that easy to define strictly. In his book, The Art of Game Design, Jesse Schell spends an entire chapter discussing what a game is. I, however, don't think we need that long a discussion to define a game. And this does go beyond video games, though it does obviously apply to them because video games are games. And if it's not a game, it's also not a video game. So what is a game? Well, first of all, it is fundamentally an activity. Obviously, not all activities are games, but games are activities. So if it's not really an activity, something you do, something you play in the context of a game, it's not a game. Two definitions I'd particularly like to highlight are an activity providing amusement or entertainment, and a structured activity governed by a set of rules. And properly speaking, a game should fit both definitions. It should be a structured activity governed by a set of rules and engaged in for the purpose of entertainment, what some people describe as fun. Yes, I do believe games should be fun and that is the primary purpose of games. And this is how games have traditionally been understood. I'm not going to nitpick about rules versus mechanics. We can just understand mechanics as a rule determining how a situation should be resolved or what the outcome of a particular action is. And for a bit of background that I do find important, games have been around for a very long time. There have been boards for the African game Mancala found to be 5,000 years old, if not older, and we do have written rules for a game, the Royal Game of Ur, that go back 4,500 years. Games come in many forms, obviously. There are board games, card games, sports, tabletop role-playing games, and very prominently in our current era, video games. And they are all activities. That is a core feature of what makes them games, is the fact that they are activities that people engage in. That does not devalidate the discussion of games as an experience, because you do experience the activity. And it is worth thinking about how someone will experience the activity when they engage in it. However, it doesn't end there. It should not end there. It must not end there, because they are not simply experiences. They are activities that you experience as you engage with them. That is, as you do them, as you play them. And that's what a game fundamentally is, a structured, rule-based activity engaged in because the experience of engaging in that activity is fun. That is, it provides entertainment. And that's how they should be thought about in terms of the activity, how the activity works, how people engage in the activity, and how they experience the activity. For at least as long as there have been games, however, there have been some other activities, notably storytelling and playing with toys, and not necessarily only toys for children. Throughout most of history, these things were entirely separate. Toys did not have rules or objectives. Stories might be engaged with on a cognitive and emotional level, but you don't engage in them. That is, you don't manipulate them, you don't control them, unless you are the storyteller. But the storyteller is either repeating them or making them up, not playing them by a set of rules. Chess, Go, poker, backgammon, football, basketball, pinball. None of these tell a pre-scripted story. And in the world of role-playing games, early D&D and other tabletop role-playing games in general were also not about telling stories. They were, if anything, about creating stories at the tabletop through the choices and actions of the player characters in the world. And they all have limitations on what can and cannot be done at any given time, either as explicit rules or implied limitations based on the equipment used, such as, for example, how a pinball machine would work. However, these boundaries were blurred by video games. Some things that we consider toys in any other medium, that is, in a physical form, are considered games when they are done digitally. Notably, Maxis, the creator of SimCity, The Sims, and numerous other games, mostly with the word sim in the title, the undisputed pioneers of the simulation genre, actually trademarked the term software toys. And if you bought one of their games back in, say, the 90s and opened the box up, you'd find a sheet of paper inside informing you that you had not actually bought a game. The thing you had was not a game. It was a toy, a software toy. This is what we now call a sandbox. Probably at least in part because the other name, software toy, had been trademarked. At the same time, other games moved in a different direction, incorporating more and more story into the game. Again, this is something you didn't find in traditional games like chess or football, and also something you didn't typically find in arcade games. There really is no plot to Pac-Man. Pac-Man doesn't tell you a story. While some early games did, in fact, have some implied story, such as that you were being invaded by space invaders or trying to fend off attacks in a nuclear war, they really had no plot. They really weren't telling you an in-depth story of any kind, and I would be hesitant to say that they were telling you a story. Bit by bit over time, games began incorporating more and more story. You had Zelda games that would feature a story about defeating Ganon and rescuing Princess Zelda, for example. And this only increased as the 90s and then the 2000s rolled on. So now we have this sort of blurring between games in the purest original sense, toys at one end of a spectrum, and games that are mostly stories at the other end. My view of story in games is that a good story can very much be the icing on the cake of an already good game. But to push the analogy further, some cakes have some frosting on the top. Some other cakes have a ton of frosting and may even have many small layers with frosting in between, making a large portion of the cake frosting, while other types have very little, and some cakes may have none at all. Pound cake being an example of a cake that traditionally has no frosting. However, at the end of the day, a cake without frosting is still a cake. But a pile of frosting by itself is not a cake. In a similar way, a good story can really enhance a lot of games, and it is entirely valid even to have a game which has telling a story as a major focus of the game, as long as there's plenty of game in there. Conversely, it's also perfectly valid to have a game such as Minecraft or City Skylines that doesn't tell you a story at all. But at their core, games are not stories. They're games. They're activities for people to do for their enjoyment. And while there are a lot of great story-rich games out there, a game that is all story may or may not be a good story, but it's not actually a game. If you haven't guessed by now, one of my complaints, one of the ways I see a lot of people, especially in the mainstream game industry, having lost the plot on games, is in thinking of them too much as being stories first and foremost, or even exclusively in terms of story, as opposed to what they fundamentally are, activities for the player to engage in. This has several negative consequences. Firstly, it does motivate people to focus on the wrong thing when designing a game. That is, to focus on it first and foremost as a storytelling medium, and while the story can be of importance for certain types of games, the gameplay is what the focus should always be on. Secondly, it allows out-of-touch games journalists to rate games on how well they like the story. Not only regardless of whether or not most players of the game, that is, most gamers in general, would like the story, but whether or not the gameplay is even good, or if there's much gameplay at all. And we've definitely seen that recently. though this can sometimes also affect some people who aren't actually journalists. And that brings me to the purpose of games. Fun, entertainment, enjoyment, however you want to state that. Let's not nitpick semantics here. I think you all know what I'm talking about. Sorry to Extra Credits, Brenda Romero, and apparently a fair number of others in the mainstream, particularly the AAA industry. But yes, games are about fun. That's what they have traditionally been for. And trying to redefine them is really redefining what games are about in a fundamental way, in a way that I don't think most people really approve of. I know I certainly don't. This can be thought of in terms of what some philosophers would describe as the telos of a thing, which basically just means the purpose. So rather than trying to sound pretentiously erudite by using the Greek word, I'm just going to use the English word purpose. The reason this is worth talking about is that the purpose of something determines whether or not a particular example of that thing is good or bad. For example, if we accept that the purpose of a knife is to cut, we know that a knife that cuts well is a good knife. A knife that doesn't cut well is not a good knife. Similarly, if you see the purpose of school as being a place where you go to learn, how well you learn and how much you learn determines whether or not that is a good school. When it comes to games, that essentially means that if games are entertainment, something we do for our enjoyment, what put simply we could call fun, then a game that isn't fun is not a good game, while a game that is fun is a good game. It doesn't really matter how technically impressive the game is. If you enjoy it, then for you, it's a good game. Take Stardew Valley, for example, with its pixel graphics. It's not really a technically impressive game, but a lot of people enjoyed it. So apparently it is, in fact, a good game. And a much better game than many high-budget AAA games that are far more technically impressive, but not necessarily much fun to play. And some people will say, well, what about horror games? Well, this is very much like going to a haunted house or watching a scary movie. People who enjoy those things are generally experiencing them as fun on some level. And they might not necessarily like feeling like they were actually in danger for their lives and fearful for their lives, but to see something a little bit scary, to experience mild fear in a controlled setting where you know you're actually safe, is fun for a lot of people. This does not devalidate the idea of games being fun. Similarly, there are some who will say, well, how can Dark Souls be fun? Well, Dark Souls is fun, let me tell you. But they are missing the whole point. This is really an example of thinking too much in terms of games as story instead of games as games. Yes, if you think of it purely as a story, it does come across as quite depressing. However, if you play it as a game, it's actually a lot of fun. Challenging, yes, and some parts can become frustrating, but by and large, it's an enjoyable experience. Yes, Dark Souls is fun. That is, it's fun if you think of it in terms of gameplay, which is how games should be thought about. And then there are the crowd that want to turn games into high art. And games are art, particularly the making of games is art. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about people wanting to turn games into a serious art form. And you'll often hear these people talking about how, well, why can't we make a Schindler's List of games, or an equivalent in games to what Schindler's List was in the movie? Well, frankly, I don't think that would be a good game. That really doesn't make sense as a game. And I won't get into the details of why that particular story wouldn't make sense as a game, but no, that's not something we need. What we need are enjoyable games that we can play and have fun with. Because in the end, that is the true purpose of games. And that comes to, are games art? Well, yes, they are. The creation of a game is art, and is particularly art in two ways, or for two reasons. First, creating games is fundamentally creative. And second, that there is a fundamental subjectivity to it. One person's fun may not be another person's fun. This is why a game for everyone is a game for no one. And just to make a comparison to some other forms of art, just as something like music theory or color theory can help the artist involved to make decisions and predictions about the effect of a certain art, in the end, not everyone likes the same music or the same art. There is unavoidable subjectivity alongside any rules of thumb that help to predict what art will be seen as good or heard as good, experienced as good by most people. And games, too, are very subjective as to what an individual will like. So they are art, but that doesn't mean they need to be serious, high art. Nor does it mean they need to have the same artistic qualities as other media, such as, for example, novels or movies. And judging them in the same way is really not appropriate. But thinking of them primarily as a storytelling medium rather than as activities we do for enjoyment leads to exactly that kind of misguided approach to judging them and even to making them. And that's a real problem. And that's why we really need to get back in touch with what games fundamentally are and what purpose they fundamentally serve. Games are rule-based activities engaged in for enjoyment. That is, they are supposed to be fun. Anyway, thank you to anyone who listened to me ramble. I still wouldn't say that I'm trying to be a real professional YouTuber, but I may look into doing a video on how climatic biomes works, similar to the one I previously did about Doom-like dungeons. And possibly something about how to run my OSR tabletop adventure module, Skirfer's Mine, though, which may or may not be public, could just be something to put on the Skirfer's Mine itch.io page. Though it would also be a chance to talk about my tabletop game mastering philosophy. And who knows, if I decide to start working on that RPG video game I was previously working on and make some actual progress on that, there may be more devlogs coming. Otherwise, there may only be a few more videos left for me before I make my last. Because, as I've often stated, I'm not a professional YouTuber. I'm not really trying to be. But anyway, thank you for listening. I hope some people found this interesting or something to think about. And have a great rest of your day.